As you may have already seen, I've spoken at length about the new guild systems and inclusions with Heart of Thorns as a part of this review series, but even still, I have left out a huge component of the new halls and what modern Guild Wars 2 guilds can accomplish together, and that is decorating. Today, we're going to take a look at that.
It is true. In helping the guild, I have learned much. The study of pen and ink is as old as the Tengu. My people consider it a sacred and beloved art. I hope you will understand that I do not undertake this task lightly. Sharing knowledge is difficult for the Tengu. We have been betrayed by others in our past. I trust you. I trust this guild. It is my honor to educate and serve those whom I respect.
Simply put, decorating is a system in the game that enables players to build an inventory of items like wagons, potted plants, trophies, trees, and architectural things that are then to be placed around a hall however you'd like to customize it. This was one of the main things I looked forward to in the expansion because I believe that a decorating system, when given appropriate attention, could be an absolutely incredible well of infinite replayability and fun. The question is whether ArenaNet did or can do it that well. We're certainly no WildStar, but I often feel as though this area of the game gets less attention than it deserves, considering how much there is to say about it. It's through the new crafting discipline, Scribing, that the vast majority of all decorations are made. The idea is that scribes write magical blueprints for a machine in the guild hall, the etheric assembly device. This functions like a real-world 3D printer. Once you've crafted a decoration blueprint, you can throw it in the assembly device, and 30 seconds later, a real object pops out that you can decorate with. Scribing is basically like every other crafting discipline, except after most things you make, there's a small time gate before you can access it, as the machine has to work away. So, with this part of the review, I feel there are two distinct areas to talk about. First is the scribing discipline, discussions of economy and accessibility, and second are the decorations themselves, how we place them, whether any of this is actually any good, and what us players find possible to accomplish. Let's start with scribing. The idea of adding a new crafting discipline with an MMO expansion is certainly a logical and marketable thing to do, but for Guild Wars 2 it wasn't exactly something I think many of us were weak at the knees over. This thing isn't like elite specializations or new PvE maps. No, in Guild Wars 2 we don't have particularly grindy crafting discipline, they're easy to swap, and there's no server-based trading post so you can corner a market by being good at crafting. As a result, disciplines have never been a huge part of the game or our identity as players. I always just saw scribing then as another bonus feature and thing to eventually go for. That said, I think when you really begin to understand it, and particularly once the economy settled down after Heart of Thorns' release, scribing is one of the most intelligently designed disciplines in the game. Unlike other disciplines, it's incredibly good at keeping all 6 tiers of items, from lowly softwood to ancient, actually relevant for crafting. Not only this, but through ink sets and other things, it actually managed to give some value to totally boring stuff that was in the game before, like the almighty potato. You can really tell that this thing was built after the developers had a couple of years feedback and understanding under their belt, born from the original launch. The scribing and finishing kits too, which are the scribe's mainstay tools, are broken down into really awesome detail. With vanilla Guild Wars 2, you'd find yourself making quite complicated objects very suddenly and weirdly, but not in scribing. Scribes will see how their metals and woods become nibs and pen shafts into pens, waters and dye hues and glass into ink bottles, and so on. This was a fact I appreciated, but actually annoyed me for a long time as I found there was just too much busy work involved in making simple stuff. But I think now that I'm used to it, the process, outside of a few outliers we'll get to later, is fairly second nature to me. I think this is a discussion of the difficulty curve, or perhaps more appropriately, the frustration curve, being a little out of balance rather than scribing being inherently flawed with its intricate makeup. Future scribing disciplines, fishmongers, gem cutters, or whatever else may be in store, really do excite me more now just because of what I saw them do with scribing. This said, one of the most high-level things I have to say about scribing might be how unintuitive the discipline is at a thematic level. Sure, being a scribe sounds damn cool, but you might wonder why it's with scribing that we make decorations instead of something else altogether, like a decorator, architect, or furnisher. And I think you'd be fair to wonder that. To get around this, the developers had to construct this idea of the assembly device, which really doesn't add too much mechanically. If the idea is that we're simply scribing a paper blueprint for a statue, it's always going to feel weird when the recipe for it is asking for real chisels. The thematic waters are muddied even further by the fact almost every other discipline in the game is already making runes, inscriptions, and insignias. All of these are thematically more fitting duties for a scribe instead. I can definitely imagine an alternate, preferable world where things had been handled differently. Scribing could have been purely the province of books, codices, bestiaries and manifestos, world versus world battle plans, consumables and the like, where multiple other disciplines could have been dropped in over time specifically for decorations. Perhaps an architect would be responsible for large construction-based objects, a furnisher creating chairs, tables and so on being its own separate thing, with new disciplines and categories coming in the future. There is still some space for this, like the developers adding a new farm building to upgrade with its associated farmer discipline to get animals in your hall. I totally think they should be doing that, by the way. This is stuff I'd love to see next expansion, but I do believe they already missed a trick and limited themselves quite a lot. One of the most illogical things you'll notice very quickly with scribing is how most of the decoration items are banded together into trees that consume themselves as you climb. Take something like a guild table. First we have a basic table, bought very easily from a merchant in your guild hall. This you spend materials on to craft upwards into a slightly different table known as a simple table. The simple table can then be crafted into a fancy table, then to a fancy long table, a fancy round table, and so on. On a spreadsheet, this might sound like a fine situation to be in, but there are actually several things that make this incredibly frustrating. Chief among them is this. After a long night scribing and sinking plenty of gold to boot on tables, you still only have one table by the end of the day. When it comes to crafting, say, gear, that's not a problem, and developers can get away with this design because you probably don't want to equip the lower tiers anyway. But this is about a decorating system. People don't want just one table, they want lots in all shapes and sizes to place around in a grand hallway or to compare with one another. The way this is currently set up is very unfortunate. It places enormous pressure on higher tier decorations to be much better than lower tiers, or else they become very unrewarding to get. That next table had best be epic looking for it to be worth straight up deleting the whole night's work before it. Sadly, this only rarely pays off, particularly for the original set of Heart of Thorns decorations. A lot of them are slight twists on one another and not worthy of being in a tree. Mushrooms are an excellent example. First you have the mushroom, which builds into the squat thorny mushroom, as seen here, which despite its name is much bigger and cooler than its predecessor, so good job here. But then taking not one, but two of the squat thorny mushrooms, and a lot more gold, will only become a thorny mushroom. Which isn't definitively better than its predecessors, it's just another variety. Lastly, and worst of all, you can spend more gold to upgrade the thorny mushroom into a crooked thorny mushroom, which again is hardly different, despite being far more expensive. Another consideration in this is how multiple scribes and multiple decorators can all be playing from the same pool of stuff at once. I've had more situations than I care to count in which I've taken a decoration from storage and upgraded it, and I say that in air quotes, only to find that someone was actually more interested in the lower tier, which is now gone. Many guilds like mine are actively seeking to have one of every decoration in the game available for people to use, but this becomes a problem to maintain when someone might, at random, accidentally craft your current stuff into supposedly higher tiers, and now you have weird gaps everywhere. There is an odd permission system that might allow you to stop people doing this, but then that limits the creativity and option of pretty much all the scribes without that rank. Sometimes these gaps can't even be filled anymore because people accidentally have used up the last of your festival specific stuff, and so many decorations in the game now are associated with festivals. This is all then exacerbated by the fact we can't preview decorations either. I actually don't think that that's that big of a problem as some would suggest, and I even like the magic of not knowing what you're going to get till it's been made, much like with legendary weapons back at the launch. Sometimes that can be really surprising and fun, like when I first made a Halloween cauldron. The problem isn't either the fact that they gave us lots of slightly different types of mushroom. More variety will always be welcome. The problem is only, in my opinion, that I just got rid of all my other mushrooms for this thing, and there is no satisfying conclusion. I suppose from some thematic perspective, the idea is that we're taking the old tables, dismantling them to understand their design, and using new materials to make new ones or something. But weren't these supposed to be blueprints anyway? There's just no need for ArenaNet to do this. If we're trying to make this look logical, it can't get any better than with the potted plants. Here, scribes are asked to take a simple planter and build it into a fancy one. Then, and only when it's fancy, can you add a plant to it. Once again, the plants are built into trees, so if you want to build your potted jungle grass and turn it into a potted golden fern, you will have to destroy the potted grass in doing so. What's hilariously crazy about this, though, is that the game will immediately ask you to make another planter. But why? What was so bad about my old one? It's the exact same item. This isn't upgrading blueprints. I just smashed the old one for no reason. Even if we somehow buy that I had to destroy the old plant to make a totally different species new one, I don't know how to reuse a pot and put soil in it a second time. I understand this mechanic as a gold sink, I do, but with the way things are set up, this is pure tedium. It's not a nitpick. These trees are filled with unbelievable amounts of pot making, and don't forget, each one needing the assembly device. Again and again, you'll be making dozens of the same damn thing before thoroughly deleting them from existence. The single greatest change to scribing I can think of would be to undo this behavior. I actually see nothing wrong with the trees themselves, and I like the way that some decorations are grouped together with them, like broken pillars eventually becoming golden walls. It's only rare that they're a bit inconsistent, like the elegant pillar here becoming a festive arch here. But scribing shouldn't consume the lower tiers as we go up, but simply maybe to require them to be there. If I made a crooked, thorny mushroom, please give me my old non-crooked one back. That's all I ask. Make me send it through the assembly again if I have to. It really doesn't matter. In some specific places, this really can't be done, but for most everywhere else, this would put scribing into a radically more cost-effective and rewarding place, with the scribes who spend an evening making tables actually ending up with a selection of tables. This solution does mean that, after the first few decorations are made, new guild scribes will effectively skip this idea of the trees forevermore, which is unideal and I do appreciate. But then, if this is so important, there are always discovery recipes which can be used to force a new scribe to work their way up just the once. It would simply take the effort of implementing them. And if all of this is still an absolute no-no, I'd say the next best thing to be done is to reduce the number of scribing and finishing kits we need. It's continually going through that awesome detail and intricate makeup I talked about on every damn pot that's just going to get thrown away that can be why scribing gets so tedious. If I'm crafting a table to look like an ever so slightly different table, don't make me spend a Grandmaster scribing kit on it. Moving on to something I really do like about scribing. While the kits are used for nearly all recipes in the game, the discipline also saw several other new items added to Heart of Thorns that interface with it in a pretty interesting way. Tree decorations, for example, are crafted with rare lumber cores that are impossible to create or buy from merchants, but must be gathered by players by cutting down trees from around the world or then exchanged on the trading post. Lumber cores from Ascalon can be used to create Ascalonian trees in your hall, while coastal lumber cores from the Tarnished Coast might make aqueous-looking plants like paddle fronds and so on. There are many such items as these cores, and in general I love what the developers are going for with this part of scribing. Generally, because these items are rare drops, they might be quite expensive. However, because decorating can be a somewhat communal thing, it's possible to take a group of friends out to that specific place and all work on it at once. I once had an experience of needing a very specific item for a lamp post that only dropped from specific enemies in a remote corner of the world at the end of a jumping puzzle. We took a large group of guildies who all wanted this decoration too out there, and because Guild Wars 2 is a game where everyone can tag a single enemy for loot and get credit, we suddenly found the item dropping in abundance and could craft, because every time one of those enemies died, it didn't have a single chance to drop the rare item, it had 50 chances to drop the rare item. The example of lumber cores works the same. You could theoretically want some Ascalonian trees and then take your guild out to deforest a whole region, only to find trees from that region now sprouting up in your guild hall because of scribing. How awesome does that sound? Unfortunately, as much as I like this, it's not quite the whole way there and does need some tweaking. Some of these items are just too rare, and it can be unclear whether the developers want you to get them in a group or not, so people don't have this experience I just talked about. The idea of a dedicated reward like this from a dedicated farm is something I think Guild Wars 2 has always failed to accomplish but could really use, and as usual, this element of scribing sort of slightly misses the mark. Mostly because many of these items are attached to another mundane thing people would do anyway, like chopping down a tree, killing a mob, or harvesting a flower. The rates have to be super low, which makes it become sort of a, oh yay, I got lucky and got this thing, or accidental event to find one, rather than a reward from a targeted search. I think the best thing ArenaNet could do to encourage this stuff is to add another buff to the Guildhall Tavern, or unique gathering tools at that, which dramatically increase your chances of getting the Scribe-based materials, but eliminate your chances of getting anything else. That way, there could be a very real possibility of gearing up to leave with a very specific purpose, or finding these items and be rewarded for it. Current options that increase gathering rare reward rates don't seem to do enough, and I wouldn't say cut the mustard. Unfortunately, as much as I enjoy scribing, there's another part that can feel kind of tedious, and it's the assembly device. I'm not really sure what the developers are doing here. This thing may have had more purpose before Heart of Thorns released, but its role has absolutely diminished over the recent year. Early on, things were arranged so that different scribed blueprints would take different lengths of time to make in the assembly, and you could boost them with a currency called resonance. Very prestigious and difficult decorations might take minutes at a time to form, while smaller ones would fly through much faster. This could be frustrating, but at least it made the assembly a part of the gameplay. Since resonance was removed, everything just takes a flat 30 seconds now. There may as well not be a part of the user interface that lists time taken, because it's never relevant. 30 seconds isn't long enough to justify the assembly device existing, really, and neither is it short enough to not be annoying when you need to put hundreds of blueprints through the machines, like, say, pots, which scribes often do. So I don't really like this, and if you're a player who's always been a bit foggy on what this thing is or how it works, as I suspect you are, don't worry, you're not missing out. Interacting with the assembly means standing there and double-clicking a few icons every few minutes. That's it. Oh, and you'll probably be hit with really bad FPS lag if you just made a lot of stuff because of all the "your item has been sent to the assembly" messages that are getting popped up, like if you've opened too many trick-or-treat bags too fast. More recently, the developers have been adding new decorations that bypass the assembly device altogether, which I appreciate at times, but it dilutes the idea of what we're doing even more. So was this giant wave from the Jade Sea I just made not from a blueprint? How on earth then is that scribing? And why does the UI still tell me it's been sent to the assembly when I crafted it, if it in fact skipped processing there altogether? Things are becoming inconsistent. The idea of having guild permissions for who can use the assembly device now feels weird too, because we're only talking about 30 seconds after all. And all of this is in the name of justifying a thematic mismatch, the scribe who makes structures with pen and paper. Perhaps the answer here is to remove the assembly device, but it does feel unique. There is some value in it, but maybe not while it only has one foot in the door. I'd rather the developers took a step back and asked themselves what they want its role in the gameplay to actually be, and then embrace whatever that is. Right now, it's just filler. Since I just mentioned them, I'll go ahead and explain early on what the books and manifestos are, as this video really won't focus too much on them. Scribing, to me and most players, is nearly all about making decorations for your guild hall, but there are a few other things available too. First, there are the guild consumables. This area of scribing is generally about getting your guild members bonuses and perks. Guild consumables include things like magic find and hero banners, banquets, instant guild storage access, and many of the items that guilds bought with influence back before Heart of Thorns released. I don't believe they expanded on that category of items at any point or updated the existing ones, when maybe they should. A guild banquet table giving a mighty +2 attribute points is hilariously out of tune with the game. You can bypass having to scribe them, by the way, and buy the items outright from an NPC back in Lion's Arch, but the prices are a bit weird, and I question why the developers are letting people backdoor the scribing system in the first place. The second category would be the world versus world schematics. These are all items scribes make for their guild inventory that aids them in the Mist's war, like trebuchets, airship defense, banners, chilling fog, watchtowers, and so on. Visually, some of these things are damn impressive. These world versus world items were all given pretty high coverage before the expansion released, and factor a lot into how the game type runs these days. It's probably possible to do an in-depth review on each and every item in this category, but to save us for now, I'll point out this one thing. Over the year, ArenaNet have had to nerf several back from their original strength as they were just too impactful for the game type. As someone who does very limited world versus world, my understanding here is very low. My guild very rarely scribes these schematics for anything other than to level up, but as far as I understand, they've become a considerable gold sink for world versus world heavy groups. They have their place. Economy talks aside, I think that's actually a good thing, by the way. The fact that the developers added a category of items that are genuinely used instead of ignored is a positive in my book, but there are a vast range of opinions on what world versus world players think the game type really needs, and far be it from me to go into that here. One extra twist to world versus world scribing is that these craftable schematics are locked off until your guild upgrades their resident war room. In terms of being a physical place, the war room is highly uninteresting and does nothing. You can't do any scribing in there, but it needs to be built up or else you'll never be able to make the good stuff. So there's this odd and unintuitive link between the war room and the workshop where all the scribing's done. Maybe this system would have made more sense if the war room had its own assembly device purely for the world versus world based stuff that scribes or even a dedicated world versus world discipline use, but the developers sadly never did this. My experience when first leveling scribing was that it was insanely expensive, until I fortunately was informed that if I crafted world versus world based stuff to level up instead, it would be much cheaper. This is absolutely true, but imagine my frustration when I couldn't find any world versus world things to make, and the game didn't do anything at all to direct me to an entirely separate building which needed upgrading first. Previously in the game, players would unlock their discipline's recipes, say tailoring, in 3 ways. Automatically as they become a better tailor, by finding recipes as loot, or discovering them. This 4th war room method represents something totally new since Heart of Thorns that so far isn't utilised anywhere else, and I just don't see the need for it. Case in point, the marketplace. The marketplace is designed very similarly to the war room when it comes to scribing. You need to upgrade it too in order for scribes to make more and cooler stuff. But the way that the marketplace handles this is by having new NPCs arrive at the building as it's upgraded, who will trade basic items that scribes need to craft. Which is much better. The game explains itself on this one. I can't help but wonder why ArenaNet went with the fairly nebulous recipe unlocking design at the war room and the merchants and NPC design at the marketplace. At least one of these options quite clearly gives the building more purpose and things to do in it. Maybe the important discussion isn't this. Maybe it's in whether locking the cool world versus world toys off beyond a lot of guild hall progression is a bad idea, as it makes new kids on the block struggle to compete. This opens a whole can of worms on world versus world balance and whether it should thrive on asymmetry though, which we could be here all day discussing. So, we have decorations, guild bonuses, world versus world schematics, and finally there are a few miscellaneous things that scribes are capable of creating too. A series of backpacks like all the other disciplines slowly unlocks as you level, eventually becoming a mini printing press. I honestly thought that Heart of Thorns might not add this, but they did. They're cool, but not something that I've thought about for many months. There are no runes with the discipline, but 3 very powerful sigils that absolutely see use, and even a series of consumables themed after essays. These are the manifestos that I mentioned earlier. They're personal consumables that have ridiculous potency, like plus 200 condition damage when you're over 90% health on a utility, not even a proper food. But rarely these things get ran because of enormous leather costs required to create them. I think the fact that this element of scribing hasn't taken on too much is more a consequence of the leather market than anything else, but if it's resolved, I think you'll see a lot more people aiming for Scribing 400 just to get at them. The most I see these be used is when people run organised triple trouble attempts, and that's about it. That last point, that people might one day level Scribing simply to craft and sell consumables on the trading post, might throw up a red flag to you. There have been arguments that this last category of items shouldn't exist at all, and it relates to a huge point I know most of you have been dying for me to talk about, and that's the nature of Scribe as a selfless discipline that is monetarily supported by his guildies. Scribing is expensive. So expensive, in fact, that many players haven't picked it up 1 year down the line. ArenaNet made several statements last year around the release of the expansion that this was by design. Scribes are selfless, they said, and whenever you make something as a scribe, it is a gift to the community you're in rather than a gift to yourself. As such, the prices are balanced for a community to pay, not an individual. The idea is that a guild pulls its resources together, gives it to a few designated guild scribes who hopefully won't then run off, and those people work away in the hall to give everyone benefits, help in the Mist War, perks in PvE, toys in the guild hall. This is quite an idealized view of the way the game might work. Because scribing can only be done in the guild hall, you might imagine a constant hustle and bustle of activity in your main base of operations by scribes to support the bulk of players elsewhere, who then earn money and feed it back into the scribes. People are interacting in more ways than they used to. ArenaNet probably sees how much replayability can come from the decorating game and wants to put good gold sinks on it while they can. This is all good design. These gold sinks will just keep giving. I opened this video by pointing out that nearly all disciplines in Guild Wars 2 before scribing were easy and didn't give a sense of identity, but scribing broke that mold. Even today, 1 year on, I have certain people on my friends list and in my various guilds who I mentally know of as, oh, this guy's a scribe. That's all pretty cool stuff. However, I think there are two big things to talk about. One is whether ArenaNet succeeded in their ambition or went too far. And second, the million-dollar question, was it a good idea at all? It can be very hard for players to be objective about scribing costs and their purpose because they go into it thinking about their own pocket instead of their guild's pocket and with no regard to ArenaNet's intent. It's also true that there are people on the other end of the spectrum, like me maybe, that might lose their objectivity also. Leaders of large guilds that don't flinch at the cost of things because they get so much money from their player base every week. As to whether ArenaNet's vision now reflects reality, I'd like to give out some facts that 99% of the average Guild Wars 2 population has no perspective for. This is a view from the top. A huge part of the last year for me, I've been keeping an eye on guild systems, specifically to learn and understand this aspect of the game, and to talk knowledgeably about it. Instead of drawing a probably biased conclusion, I'll just tell you how things have been and let you decide. Let's lay it on the line. How hard is getting a good haul? Is this stuff impossible? I've made thousands of decorations with guild funds. Over the year, I've watched my haul grow from having absolutely nothing to a very significant amount of decorations. We have all the prestige stuff and high quantities of the other good stuff. The footage in the background of this video is evidence as to the wild types of hauls we've made. I have never seen a haul with a higher quantity of decorations than ours has, but I'd be hesitant to say we're the absolute best out there. Make no mistake, there are people who have been trying a lot harder and a lot longer than I have. To do this, I've definitely needed a lot of money, and far more than any individual could pay. So, good job there, I guess. I would estimate something to the tune of 15,000 gold or so has gone through our guild that I have specifically seen purely on decorations to get just this far. And that's a low ball. 15 to 20,000 gold. But forgive me if my maths isn't quite perfect. There are some players with that amount of money, but I'd guess it's somewhere less than 500 game-wide, and those probably aren't the kind of players who would like to spend that sort of money. Perhaps that gives you some clarity, but a number on its own means nothing when we're talking about community funding. That still doesn't tell us out of reach this is. The guild to support those high costs then was this. We're Spud. We're a low to medium activity group of players that's nonetheless at maximum player cap. We have the full 500 players, and this basically never drops lower. We probably have less people sincerely invested in us than you might see in other 500 player guilds. The way I've taken money from people for decorations is to ask people when they join for a one-time donation of whatever they want. If they don't do this and then they become inactive, they're likely to be kicked for someone else who wants to join. If they donate an absolute pittance, like less than a single daily of 2 gold, I refuse it because they clearly need it more than the guild does. With just this system, and the fact that we don't spend money on World vs. World, and the fact that we finished up building our upgrades, we've built the inventory of decorations you've been seeing in the background. We also tried to pool money for giveaways and things too. There was no penny pinching, no required tax rules or anything like that. It was just pay what you want and the generosity that came from it. So, did ArenaNet get this right? You tell me. I think you'll see that from my experience, I don't think things look so bad, but maybe that's bias. Maybe things are bad, I just got lucky with the economy, or perhaps you might think my metrics don't count because I'm wood and potatoes, and maybe I've experienced more generosity than most guilds would, which is something I'm absolutely open to. As I mentioned a moment ago though, maybe the question isn't whether ArenaNet got their idea implemented correctly 1 year down the line. Maybe the question is on the idea itself. Should scribing have been a community funded thing with a huge gold cost to access it? The first great shame to establish as we move into this discussion is this. The cost of scribing and getting lots of fun decorations does not scale with guild size. In a perfect world, small guilds would have just as much opportunity to build things up as the big ones, and I think this would have been a substantial improvement. Many of you will have heard my 500 player guild a moment ago and immediately fixated on that, because you're nowhere near that number, nor do you even want that number. I think you're right to be sad about that. Guild scaling never happened, and if you're a very antisocial player, in a tiny group of friends, or even going alone, I wouldn't expect to play with many decorations at all. That utterly sucks. Shortly after Heart of Thorns, there were talks of people trying to Iron Man scribing in guild halls to get everything all on their own, and not a single project like that has come to my attention having been completed. One obvious huge improvement to this idea would have been guild scaling, but it never came and the devs have never talked about implementing it. So it really feels like small guilds have lost out. Since pretty much the only cool thing to do in halls is to decorate right now, that's a substantive loss, no? The feature may as well not be there. To be the contrarian for a moment, maybe one thing to chew on is the fact that in Guild Wars 2 we can have so many guilds at once. So what if small guilds can't do it, you might think? Just join a bigger guild and play around there. This is a good thing. ArenaNet are bringing people together. Large guilds are, by their very definition, the homes for hundreds of players, so it's totally wrong to suggest that this is a widespread issue. These people just need to get out of their shells. They're in an MMO, for Christ's sake. I'm not sure these arguments go the whole way to justifying the heavy scribing costs, but I do think they have some validity and are unfairly shot down too often. It's definitely true that the 5 guild system eases pressure on you a lot to either become a scribe or access places that scribes have made lots of things. And I do think it's a healthy thing that in the game we have some large guilds with lots of stuff and other smaller guilds that have less or different stuff. People who are in my guild, Spud, for example, will also be in many other guilds, smaller communities that don't have as much stuff, and they get the best of both worlds. I'd say that's the majority situation to be in. Yet, even with this in mind, I think no, having Scribe be expensive is not a justifiable thing. Whether the big guilds like Spud, as I've demonstrated, can do it or not, there have been just too many players disappointed and locked out of using decorations because they have none in storage and it's so grindy to get started. I do agree with the idea of having scribing be a gold sink that never stops giving, but the price of decorations should have been balanced that most were low and some were high. As it currently stands, too few of us can actually get our feet in the door. This is a huge reason why I suggested what I did earlier, that recipes stop deleting earlier items. It's not just because it's tedious and unrewarding to go through that, but because more and smaller groups should be getting more bang for their buck. There's another aspect to this argument for me too. Ultimately, because scribing is still a discipline and not something totally new, there are too many things that undermine the notion that it is purely selfless and should be balanced for community funding. Earlier, I mentioned a series of items, back pieces, sigils, consumables. None of these feel out of place for scribing as a discipline, but they are absolutely out of place if the discipline was ever to be a selfless thing, as they're all personal rewards. At the release of Heart of Thorns, I distinctly remember a friend of mine who power leveled Scribe, did very little guild-based stuff with it, but then started turning a ridiculous profit by selling the new sigils on the trading post for hundreds of gold when no one else could get them. This is a personal reward. Manifestos and the like are a personal reward. Achievement points and a title are available for individuals who build Scribe, which are also personal rewards. People feel a personal incentive to level Scribe because it's a discipline. Maybe they want them all maxed. Then they'll be all the more frustrated when they realise it requires a steep price. Even when looking at the idea of scribes making decorations, and that decorations are a community reward rather than a personal one, things break down. I'd hazard 80% of the time when players are scribing, it's because they personally want that specific decoration to build their personal thing with it. This is an experience I constantly go through. Yes, that decoration will now forevermore be available to the community, but it doesn't escape the fact that many scribes have selfish ambition, especially when starting out. The idea of it being a community-funded discipline only was a nice concept, but I think it's only frustrated people. If that was the angle, this needed to be done through something different, purely about group funding, like the Treasury. A moment ago, I brought up a picture of scribes working away in their guild hall to support the bulk of players out doing something else. Well, this doesn't disappear as soon as scribing becomes balanced for personal progression instead of group progression. All that changes are the number of people who can actually choose to be the scribe, instead of a select elite few that were deemed worthy by the guild's officership once upon a time. Were these prices really needed when the formal upgrade progression for restoring Guildhall buildings was also a community-funded venture? Were these prices really needed when you can use other systems like the Guild Trader or World Boss trophies to incentivize future guild donations? Was this system really needed when we could be using other risk-free systems for guild spending instead of putting them in the hands of individuals that might run away? Personally, I never had a problem, nor have I ever heard of it happening where a guild scribe has stolen community funds for themselves, but was this design worth opening the game up to that risk? I say no. Scribing should have been balanced from the start to cost about the same as the other disciplines. They make a mix of things for themselves, like decorations, sigils, and back pieces, and some things purely for the guild, like World vs. World airships, which can then specifically cost a bit more, and their friends can choose to donate for. Done. Just about the only thing we lose out on is a sense of player identity with scribing, which sucks, but it's a small price to pay. This video has been a bit of a downer, yet I really do love scribing, and you might wonder how that can be. Well, I actually think ArenaNet had a change of heart over the year, as they've made significant efforts to bring the price of scribing down and to be more accessible, which is where I've begun to embrace it. Maybe they see what we're saying too. Particularly, their new festival decorations have been much larger and cheaper than any vanilla ones, adding way more options for us. Even better, pre-release, the developer suggested that decorations could appear on the gem store, which I'm happy to report absolutely hasn't happened. It's all been quite available because of these various patches, and here's something that really might surprise you. Scribing today, while still expensive, and everything I just said is very much true, scribing is nowhere near the cost it once was, and that's because of developer intervention. It's a great thing. Any review at the launch of Heart of Thorns would have blasted scribing to hell and back, and rightfully so, but many of those original issues have now passed. I can't help but feel not enough people have updated their mindset on this. I risk becoming public enemy number one here, but I seriously think the community perception towards scribing is utterly warped. It should be cheaper. Those numbers I gave earlier are no joke, but this is an area of the game I love seeing people finally getting excited by. So do at least watch the new festival updates they throw in for decorations and see what you think. Every set so far has been of a fantastic quality. Just now I mentioned the launch of Heart of Thorns and how this didn't go well, to the point many of us still haven't reconsidered trying decorating out. Since the whole idea of these videos is to do a year in review, it would feel totally wrong to skip out on those problems and inform you on what precisely happened. When Heart of Thorns released, scribing, and therefore the entire decoration system, was a shambles. This is because the discipline required a lot of new items only obtainable from the expansion that the community hadn't been able to farm yet, and there were also many other sinks for. Now consider the fact that thousands and thousands of players were all clamoring to be a new scribe all at once. The result was no one could do much, and no scribes meant no decorations. Lots of guilds were claiming their shiny new halls at release, only to find they couldn't do anything with them yet before leaving. I think linseed oil was the poster child for this problem. Almost all decorations in the game required access to this new crafting material, and at the same time, guild hall upgrades themselves, which I've discussed before, also required the stuff. Add on top of this the newly released Night Fury Prestige shoulder piece for Halloween and several other things, which wanted even more linseed oil, and the price of this item, and therefore scribing, bloated to incredible levels. Don't forget either that scribing, like any other discipline in the game, can be leveled up, and it's only at the later levels you start getting vaguely cool stuff. This problem with linseed oil and another guild-based material, resonating slivers, made being an early scribe incredibly frustrating. You were unable to craft much of anything very fun, and were faced with spending well over 1,000 gold to max out the discipline for several months. That's before even building an inventory. This problem became so bad, in fact, that it brought on early developer intervention on two separate occasions. First, during the very early release, the devs actually pointed players specifically to farm spots for some of these new materials in order to bring down the price of linseed oil. I myself made the areas known on a video too, as I was going for the Halloween shoulder piece. Later, the cost of scribing remained high because of resonating slivers, which I mentioned a moment ago. This was another new material that would only drop from completing guild missions, and scribes needed huge amounts of. The problem here is that the rewards for guild missions are time-gated, so the supply of resonating slivers could never catch up with the demand. Developers intervened by massively reducing the amount of slivers required by scribing, as well as adding them as rewards in other areas of the game, namely dailies. While this did alleviate a lot of economic pressure on scribes, and I am in favour of, I sort of hate this second change in today's Guild Wars 2. See, the numbers for launch resonating slivers were definitely out of whack, but the system itself was a great concept. For as long as slivers had worth, there was far more incentive to run guild missions because players could earn better money from them. This gave people a reason to hang out with their guilds more, even if it was old stuff they'd done 100 times already. A dedicated reward from dedicated content that kept communities together. A guild-based item for completing guild missions. What are slivers today? Well, there are hardly any places to use them. They have utterly no value, 12 copper each. Communities have little incentive to play together, and 95% of the time when you're earning a resonating sliver, it has nothing to do with what it's used for. These things are just bloat now. They confuse new players who don't need to pay attention to them yet, annoy veteran players who have to keep clearing the crap out of their inventories and banks, and frustrate scribes who have to go through the tedium of picking them up from the trading post. ArenaNet can have a bit of a bad reputation for knee-jerk overreactions with their patches, and I absolutely think in this case it's justified. Lowering the amount of slivers scribes needed was more than enough, but the places we got them from should have been left alone. At least then slivers would have a real sense of purpose in the game. I really hope this gets addressed soon too, as day by day the supply keeps going up and it will be harder and harder to turn back. There's another problem with resonating slivers while we're on this topic, and it's a part of some inconsistent design within scribing. Veteran players of this game might recognize that a sliver is actually a category of crafting material in a big long chain. So for example, you have destroyer slivers, which can then be built into shards and on until cores and lodestones. Resonating slivers are actually the same. Scribes can craft the slivers all the way up to lodestones if they like, but again, since the patches, there is almost zero reason to do this. There are a couple of very specific furniture decorations that use the other varieties of resonating item, and that's all. Again, it's just bloat and asking players to fiddle around for now what looks like an arbitrary reason. I think ArenaNet need to either add a lot more decorations and recipes that actually want this stuff, or to just be done with them because they undermine the idea of it being a cohesive and well thought out system. Back to the difficulty with leveling Scribe at launch. There was one final nail in the coffin too. This is a point I think most non-scribes, and particularly new players to the game, would have missed, but it was an important one and just weird design. This was the Guildhall Marketplace. See, not only were many scribing recipes very expensive because of linseed oil, resonating slivers, and other specific items, but they also often required other decorations that can only be obtained from the marketplace. Same deal for the war room that we mentioned earlier. On paper, I can see what they were going for, integrating the idea of building your hall up as much as possible with scribing so it all gels together. The problem though at the release of Heart of Thorns was that no guild had those upgrades. You could have been the biggest credit card farming scribe in existence and had thousands of the necessary materials, but you'd still be stuck because your market wouldn't be able to supply you with the last stuff until a month or two from now. This design is quite a difficult thing for me to assess. See, now that many guild halls have been built up and are established, it's unlikely to ever be a problem for new scribes again. They'll just visit one of their 5 guild halls that has the appropriate upgrades and level it there. So that's a good thing? Is there any point mentioning this? I think it's fair to say that if Heart of Thorns introduced halls first and then scribing came a year later, there would have been much less complaining. But does that necessarily make this integration a good part of Heart of Thorns? I'm not sure. If people would just be bypassing that experience of waiting on the hall to upgrade, was it really needed? In my individual assessment of the marketplace on the previous installment, I explained that I'd rather see all basic decorations, as well as being substantially expanded on, to be available very early in guild progression. Hopefully you can see how this would have helped out the release of the game. Not only are scribes no longer time gated, but people have more stuff to play with anyway. Small things like varieties of crates and chairs should be fast and simple to get, not based on scribing and not costing potentially 50 gold each. Higher marketplace upgrades could simply reduce prices instead of adding new wares. Another odd and detrimental thing came as a consequence of this too. See, because people couldn't decorate much when they first visited their halls, they became less interested in visiting again and in upgrading their halls. And because they were less interested in upgrading their halls, there was even less decorations their scribes could make. My personal experience with this was very black and white. For as long as the hall needed upgrading, we had no decorations. There just wasn't any money for it. It was only when we were done and all the beautiful animations of the buildings being reconstructed and environments changing had long passed that people finally started decorating and using the hall. We never had both at once. It's like there could have been this great feeling of a very dynamic hall where both decorations and environments were changing at the same time as one another. That never ended up really panning out just because scribing was in such a poor state at release, and there's this weird ironic balance thing. And so that is scribing. Those are what I see as its current problems, and also as its very early ones. It really didn't have the explosive release into the game I think it should have, but I'd still love if, over time, people more take to it, and ArenaNet aren't scared to pursue the idea of more disciplines in future expansions either. At the start of the video, I mentioned that we can talk about scribing and then we can talk about the actual process of decorating itself. Let's round everything out by doing that now. I actually have a lot less to say on the process of decorating because it's a pretty simple thing, but what there is to mention is quite important. Decorating, like scribing, has a lot of room for improvement. Decorating since the release of Heart of Thorns has hardly changed mechanically at all. Much earlier in the year, after my first experiences with the system, I made a video on what I thought at the time the biggest changes it needed were, which is still very much relevant today. Despite this, I'm happy to say ArenaNet did address some of these common problems, and there has been a little bit of quality of life added. While in a guild hall, players are able to click a button from the inventory tab saying decorate, which will flip their skill bar to a new selection of abilities and place a large orange cog floating over their head, signifying that they are in decoration mode. From here, using their skill 6, the player can open a mini window that shows every decoration the guild currently has available for use. This window used to close after every single decoration was dropped, which was incredibly frustrating, especially when the guild had a lot of stuff because it would actually lag your client when first opening it. Thankfully, this is one of the issues the developers have now addressed, and the process of selecting decorations to drop is pretty easy. There's a small box you can type in to find exactly what you want, as well as several categories to browse from like architecture, plants, furniture, and so on. These categories over time have become a bit bloated. I'd love to be looked at, like why are flags and banners in architecture? Why is the Globe of Whispers, the single largest decoration in the game worthy of a building all on its own, considered furniture? Should the Eternal Flame, the Halloween monument, be in festivals or monuments? Not to mention the increasingly bloating size of the trophy section, filling to the brim with impossible to obtain PvP trophies that really should be hidden from view in my opinion. If ArenaNet do intend to add like animal decorations one day with a farm, or a horticulturalist with even more plants, which I really think they should, or anything else in a big batch, they'll have to look at this idea again. The user interface isn't working out, or perhaps new things should get new panels altogether, broken into things like insects, animals, rare game, and so on. Another excellent change made during the course of the year relates to item deletion. At release, decorators had 3 very crude erasers. You had a big eraser that would delete a huge area of stuff, a medium one, and then a small one. Except they were all far too big to do much detail work, and it made placing decorations a nightmare, as there may be no easy way to go back once you've done it without deleting all the other decorations around that new one too. This was exacerbated by the fact that many large decorations literally couldn't be deleted at all with a small eraser. And the fact that there's no flying mode to accompany decorating means that large projects often require scaffolding, and the scaffolding couldn't be delicately removed. ArenaNet resolved these problems by adding a single decoration erase tool. This has been a huge improvement, and since that time, a lot more interesting builds have sprouted up. In truth, the thing does sometimes seem to delete multiple things anyway, but I haven't seen it happen consistently enough to properly assess, nor have I seen anyone else reporting the issue except myself, so maybe don't listen to this one too closely. Having a flying mode, by the way, is something I've seen often requested, but I don't actually think it's that necessary to have. If anything, I enjoy that building cool jumping puzzles up in the sky or massive statues has this added component of wow factor to consider because of the logistics of it. It makes decorating feel like it might still very much be a part of Guild Wars 2, and that we're not utterly breaking the game, flying around like a dev. Flying, were it added as a decorator, might also seriously limit ArenaNet's design space when thinking of other things for people to do in the halls, which I've spoken about on a previous installment in the series. One thing I think decorating seriously needs is some kind of edge-to-edge placement. What we currently have is very rudimentary. The ability to rotate left and right, that's it. If you wanted to make a nice long platform made up of multiple Super Adventure Box decorations that are perfectly tessellating, you have a very tedious job ahead of you. Edge-to-edge placement with, say, a modifier key that snaps decorations together for you to place them would be so excellent. Also desperately needed, I feel, is the ability to rotate decorations on more than one axis. I'm really not sure why ArenaNet haven't allowed us to do this, as it would utterly explode the amount of creative options players have. Take a Super Adventure platform again, for example. As it stands, this can only be used in a couple of ways: a flat, grassy surface as a ceiling or a floor. If players could rotate this, it could become walls or slopes, comboed with other platforms to become hills or pyramids and so on. You could flip it upside down, and instead of having a grassy floor, have a cave floor. And it's all there already for them if they just let us rotate. This goes for everything. You might perhaps think that ArenaNet just don't want players to have this kind of control, so they have more space to make their own new decorations that specifically are slopes and cave floors and so on, but I hardly think that they're that limited with the new designs. I honestly don't understand what's holding them back, or what held them back pre-Heart of Thorns. Another massive improvement to go hand in hand with this would be decoration scaling. This is the concept of being able to choose how big or small a decoration is based on an upper and lower bound set by the devs. It should be obvious why this would be so incredible for decorating. Many more decorations, currently far too small, would now have impressive uses. This isn't just about creativity, but scribing the economy too. Mushrooms feel rewarding for scribes to make because they're big, while many other things do not because they're small. If decorators could simply scale themselves, as we see the developers routinely do with their own assets in the rest of the game, everyone is happy. This would be a positive change like almost no other. There are several examples in the rest of the game of ArenaNet using such tactics to true extremes. An enormous castle set piece in the World vs. World Obsidian puzzle might appear elsewhere in a much more miniature form. If the engine is capable, again, what holds us back? Well, actually on this I think I might know. One thing to consider is how decoration size is factored into their availability, and to allow decorators to decide item size themselves would totally throw this off balance. The etheric hollows from Fractals are an excellent demonstration of this. You can pay a smaller price for a small dancing hologram, or triple the price for one about 3 times the size. This doesn't make sense if decorators can make the small one big and the big one small. So the solution is an obvious one, but takes work. Allow decorators to scale items, but set a variable upper and lower bound on each one's limits. This way you can have more expensive decorations be scaled much bigger than other cheaper ones, and the integrity of the system is preserved. It would just take the time of manually going through every decoration and setting it up, and that may be where the problem is. One often unspoken of and more subtle mechanic of guild halls that's related to decorations is the process of actually getting people to see and enjoy them. I thought I'd mention this as the developers actually did quite well in this regard. We do have some videos popping up, yes, and maybe not as many as I would have liked, but pre-release we were also informed that you didn't need to formally be in a guild in order to visit a hall. Simply party or squad on someone and you'll get into it to have a tour. There were definitely issues with this for many months, and the idea of running events in halls was an absolute hell, with many people being locked out and suffering unresolvable connection issues. However, that mess seems to have mostly been cleared up. Yes, guilds do spin up new instances far too frequently for my liking, but people are much more easily able to get together now, and the aforementioned party squad mechanism totally works. I've offered several tours of the Spud Hall to people and had to do nothing more than just let them join my party for them to run around and have a look. Pre-release, I was hoping that if this all worked out well enough, we might see LFG categories and groups of people hanging around guild hall entrances to see what each other have made, try jumping puzzles or other challenges. One of the best updates ArenaNet did for all of decorating and scribing throughout the year was to add a new category of decoration called monuments. These are items you can drop down and leave little notes with. This has enabled people to make cool riddles and puzzles and adventure-style experiences within their halls that hopefully then people will share. These are great ideas, and the monuments definitely added a lot, but unfortunately it's still not quite how I had originally hoped. The most you'll see is people on LFG buying and selling decorations like super clouds, and very rarely will you ever find someone hanging around a guild hall entrance. So that all leads me on to my last point. I just mentioned how scribing may have held these systems back, but it's not just scribing. Even these other missing features like y-axis rotations and scaling being missing probably aren't that important when compared to my final point. I'm afraid to say. The two absolute largest problems with decorating in guild halls are our old friends, global cap and local cap. 1 year ago, before Heart of Thorns, players were told that in order to stop the servers overloading and just for safety, the developers would be implementing caps on the decoration system. These would be upper limits on how many decorations you can place that are so high that, and I quote, no reasonable player should expect to ever encounter them. What a joke. Now, I tend to be a fairly optimistic guy. I don't bandwagon on hail corporate or assume everyone in the industry is lying through their teeth purely for the money, but I find myself at a loss here. I really have to wonder what ArenaNet was thinking when they said this, because the two caps in place right now are a serious problem. First, there's local cap. This is the lesser of two evils, in my opinion. Local cap is a limitation on how many decorations you can cram into a small area. In principle, this is an important thing. Imagine a player with 1,000 crates, putting them all in a tiny pile. This pile might get damn laggy, and aside from being a bit trolly, there really is no value to that activity. Local cap stops this being able to happen by saying, hey, there are already enough crates here, go away. The problem is that local cap is so low, it's almost impossible to make much of anything cool with small decorations. Contrary to the quote that no player would hit the cap, I'd put money on the idea that every single player who has ever tried decorating has probably hit local cap. It is simply everywhere. You can't decorate a house with a rug, a grandfather clock, candles, tables and chairs because, oh whoops, local cap will hit you. You can't make a cool statue with pretty good detail work because, oh god, local cap strikes again. You can't build a house or a tower or a castle or many of the things most of us thought we'd be doing and then also actually put stuff in it because, oh, local cap strikes again, where the decorations making up the walls and ceiling and floors are counting against the number of things you can actually have inside the building you've constructed. Some have suggested that local cap isn't a big problem. It's that players are simply decorating wrong, and they shouldn't be trying to build houses, because this is a decorating system and it's meant for light detail work. But this is nonsense. ArenaNet themselves added an architecture section with large gold walls, and especially the Super Adventure Box set shows they know players care about this stuff. And besides, even if you're trying to decorate properly, like a table and chairs, you're still going to hit local cap. Local cap throttles player creativity to no end. So why is it set by the developers at such a low value? Some have suggested it's to preserve the FPS of players' clients, and it's absolutely true that having more decorations, more densely placed, would be more taxing on people's systems. This is absolutely something that needs to be monitored, and I cannot agree more with. However, that said, there is definitely a lot of room to give here. The creativity loss over this is just too great for the system to truly flourish right now, and as I've mentioned before, a little lower FPS here and there is something communities can absolutely handle among themselves. Some people dared to be combative over this stance, but this isn't PC elitism, it's common sense. Even if we imagine the worst possible scenario, in which 1, you play on a potato, 2, local cap is flat out removed, which I'm not asking for. Local cap is a smart system, it just needs a higher bound on it. And 3, your guild decorates an area so densely you get low FPS, you always have the option of not going to that area, or asking them to not do that. These people are your guildies, right? Not total randoms. It's fine, really. I mean, hell, let's take this further. Number 4, your guild chooses to bundle all of those decorations right at the main waypoint, so you can't avoid them without going to another waypoint. But then 5, they do the same at all the guild synthesizers, and obviously you just have to get those every day. 6, then your guild actually has the inventory to FPS lag out every single waypoint in your hall, so you can't even enter it anymore. You can always just go to one of your other 5 guilds. Oh, but wait, you also have all 5 of your guilds with epic quantities of decorations that destroy your potato? Just don't visit a hall. This is not the equivalent of uninstalling your game. It's like these people would argue TNT shouldn't be in Minecraft because you can lag up the game by exploding too much. Communities would simply find a decent balance for their members' FPS and be mindful of it. If you're in 5 guilds full of trolls that are crashing your client, maybe look in the mirror for the problem. And neither would an increase in local cap be something the developers couldn't revert if it somehow did become an epidemic, as you might suggest. So that's local cap. It's bad. Earlier, I described this as the lesser of 2 evils though, and I really do mean that. See, while local cap is bad, with big enough decorations, you can sort of get around it. Just look at our magical forest footage that's been playing in the background. There are some annoying inconsistencies where you can delete a decoration to make space for a new one, but still not be able to place anything. But with very clever planning, it's definitely possible to do relatively impressive things, as I hope the footage in the background is now showing. Local cap just needs to be eased off that bit more. The greater of 2 evils, in my opinion, is global cap. Global cap is another restriction on the number of decorations a player can drop, except this time it is guild hall wide. Just like with local cap, this is a restriction players are constantly faced with. When local cap stops players making cool looking stuff, global cap stops players making anything at all. And there is no proper error indication for it either. Your things will just be placed, then vanish again for seemingly no reason. It encourages players to delete each other's stuff, as there's no decoration claiming or permission system, and leaves a good 75% or more of all guild halls totally barren of being decoratable. I actually have produced a separate video on global cap altogether as a part of this review series, which I'll be linking to in just a moment if you'd like to assess it for yourself or hear more discussion on the topic. But as we're already pushing a lot of time here today, I think I'll leave it there. And that, my friends, is scribing and decorating. As comprehensive as I could possibly be. It's a complicated area of the game that in places is deeply flawed, but is also an amazing area of Heart of Thorns. I hope it serves as a testament to you all just how good this can be, that despite all these negative things I've said today, I'm still excited about decorating and where ArenaNet might take it. Not to mention my proposed solutions from today, there's just so much room for expansion, like seeing the arena kill floor florals and turret decorations or dynamic moving decorations become available for the rest of the hall, which would explode the number of creative things players can do. What about skybox decorations, making the hall look Halloweeny or Winter's Day-ish, target dummies, and the ability to reposition NPCs where you like? There are so many things that I still want to see. Over the year, we've seen gradual improvements to the system. These new festival releases in which bulk new decoration sets are dropped in have been fantastic. Generation 2 Halloween decorations are some of the best they've ever done. The Super Adventure Box set that they released have been some of the best they've ever done. Same with the Lunar Festival. Even where these festivals are lacking new content lately, the decorations have saved them for me. And that I cannot be happy enough about, and I want to see more. Perhaps at some point they'll get to many of these suggestions that I myself and others in the community have proposed, but whether we'll see those in small patches like the festival ones, or they're holding them all off in bulk for whatever expansion comes after Heart of Thorns, I'm really not sure, and who the hell knows when that will be. Until next time guys, thanks very much for watching, I'll see you next time.